Hello, my name is Sam Feltham, and welcome to Expert Interviews here on Smash the Fat. And with me today is chemical engineer Ivor Cummins. How you doing, Ivor?
Doing great, Sam. Thanks a lot for having me on.
No worries, no worries. A real pleasure. Because it was a couple of weeks back that you posted up a couple of lectures. Your first one kind of on obesity, and then your second one on what you've called the cholesterol conundrum. And they're absolutely excellent lectures, I must say. Very entertaining as well as educational at the same time. So just first things first, just to give the listeners and viewers a bit of background on yourself, what made you go from kind of chemical engineer into kind of researching about obesity and cholesterol and heart disease and things like that?
Well, Sam, it was kind of necessity at the time. Around a year and plus ago, I got some blood results, and I wouldn't have any expertise at that point. And I had high gamma glutamyl transferase, serum GGT, it's a liver enzyme, and high serum ferritin, a couple of other things. So I have a long history of decades of complex problem solving and leading teams of engineers. But often when I go in and I realize a team is struggling and they don't really know the answers to the questions, I usually go myself to the raw data, to make sure I get the raw data, interpret it correctly. But as it happened, there were a few GPs I talked to at the time, and they weren't very clear on the risk associated with these metrics, and they weren't very clear on how to address them. So I was concerned, having 5 children, on that, because I very quickly found out the mortality curve data for these metrics, and they don't look pretty. So I knew the answer to the first question, that it was a significant problem to address. And then I decided to go in and start researching. So not read any books or just populist books, or I had no idea about low carb at the time. I went straight to the last 50 years of medical and scientific literature pertaining to GGT and ferritin, and I began to decode what was out there, and there was a lot. So within a few weeks, I had pretty much got my path forward on those metrics and what to do. And I also discovered the metabolic syndrome in passing, because it relates.
Yep.
And I conversed with the director of the Iron Institute in the States with my hypothesis at that stage as to what I needed to do, and they validated, absolutely. So that was the first couple of weeks, and then I realized how much was out there in the research world and how accessible it was to someone with a technical background and that kind of capability.
Awesome, awesome. And then how did you kind of get into this position where you're kind of lecturing? Is this at your place of work, or where is this?
Yeah, as it happens, I mean, it's very much a personal thing, but I did bring it back to the work environment. And it was after a few weeks that I began to study the lipidology and cholesterol. Again, there are a lot of synergies and interactions here, and a lot of things are interrelated. But as I began to go through all of that and understand it, I realized that there isn't a lot of material out there that pulls the whole story, the conundrum, if you will, into one kind of narrative. So I decided that, well, wouldn't it be good to put it together and then give other people the benefit of seeing the technical and the risk factors and what you can do to address those risk factors, and also kind of just lift the lid and expose to the air all the research the last 50 years and what it really says. So the first one, metabolic syndrome, I gave, and I was kind of nervous going into it because I had spoken publicly a lot before in my job role and elsewhere, but I'd never taken this kind of material to a very large forum, like over 120 people, I think, to a standing room only, and actually delivered it. But it turned out to be really, really good. Got a huge amount of positive feedback. A lot of people who switched over, and a lot of people who are doing a lot better now based on understanding the science and taking action. So that was the metabolic syndrome, and then I went on and I said cholesterol needs its own seminar. So I touched on it in the metabolic syndrome. I referred to small dense LDL, I referred to the endothelium without really explaining it. So I thought, well, okay, I've got to go back and I've got to actually explain the full narrative, which I did. And I think the second one, with the higher quality video and probably better content, is what's been noticed out there the last few weeks.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, because it's kind of gone viral through the kind of real food, low carb, paleo kind of community, because it's so clearly explained, and you're probably right. The second interview might have got a bit more viral because of the better quality, just in terms of the video itself, maybe not the lecture itself, but yeah, it's incredible, and you've kind of set up your own website called the Fat Emperor as well. So tell us a little bit about that as well.
Okay, well, I know it sounds unusual. It kind of was an idea that I had, and I was discussing with my wife one evening. I wanted to get into a little bit of web design just as a hobby, and also I had material I wanted to load beyond YouTube. But I just kind of thought up this three-level analogy. You know, the Emperor's New Clothes story, where people all believe they're correct, even though they're not. So I kind of thought of the last 50 years of trials and experiments that were done, but there was a lot of confirmation bias because from the start people believed it was fat that was bad, and then a lot of experiments were kind of badly designed and were kind of force fit to fit the hypothesis. So there was kind of an incorrect hypothesis carried by all the people, even though I'm sure a lot of them must have begun to have second thoughts about it, but you couldn't really say, hey, this hypothesis is wrong. I mean, now it's happening. It's fantastic in the last while. But for many decades, unfortunately, this incorrect hypothesis had to be maintained, like the emperor's birthday suit. And then also the emperor kind of represents, I suppose, a lot of commercial, powerful interests that would have aligned with the hypothesis and structured themselves, their businesses around it. So changing it doesn't fit, and I won't get into any details there. So it's kind of an analogy for what's happened, kind of a metaphor, and that was it. So I kind of just picked that picture and went with it.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's a beautiful picture you've kind of painted here, and people can check that out. Is it thefatemperor.com?
It's yeah, thefatemperor.com.
That's right, and people can get in contact with you via Facebook and Twitter there as well. But going back to your second lecture there, the Cholesterol Conundrum, and you kind of touched on it there. Some initial experiments and trials were kind of poorly designed, and then people kept on kind of going with it that, yeah, fat's the enemy and things like that. But why is this such a conundrum, and why is there such contradictory opinions on this problem?
Well, I guess historically, and I discovered later, because as I went through the research and realized what the kind of correct hypothesis was, I did begin to wonder, how did this come about? And that's a story many viewers are probably familiar with. There was a mistaken interpretation by Ancel Keys mainly. A Professor Yudkin in England at the time had pretty much proven to himself that sugar and refined carbohydrates are the real drivers of dyslipidemia and the issues and heart disease. But I think Ancel Keys had a lot of influence, a very powerful public figure as well, and established this dogma that it was the saturated fat and cholesterol, or not cholesterol, in fairness, he never suggested cholesterol in the diet was the problem, with saturated fat. And the McGovern Commission in 1972, there was a lot of coronary heart disease in the States. He was one of the main guys, and they kind of took this vision of saturated fat being bad, and they politicized it, and they basically made it a message to the population. But it was mostly based on a correlation. So it was the correlation of country saturated fat percentage to heart disease. But there were 22 countries with data, and Ancel picked 7 of them that went on a nice line, which is kind of engineering heresy. So he particularly offended me with that move. But after that, I think there was an alignment of industry and research people behind accepting that it was the fat. I heard a good joke once by someone, if you go with correlations and eating fat will give you blood fat, well, that means if you eat purple cabbage, your blood will go purple. So it's intuitive, and I can understand why they believed it. And they found fat and cholesterol in the atheroma, in the arteries. So there's a lot of association, and unfortunately not really causation. But yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because this is an important thing, kind of, especially in nutrition science, is that a lot of hypotheses are kind of created from epidemiology, which is the study of kind of general population and correlations and things like that. And that's kind of like the same through all of science. But that's kind of where a hypothesis starts, and then you start to do randomized controlled trials, which is where you kind of really rigorously test your hypothesis to maybe turn it into a true theory. But what kind of sort of spurred them on, and when did the evidence actually kind of change to saturated fat and just fat generally isn't particularly a problem?
Yeah, well, I suppose the evidence, when you go back, goes way back, saying that saturated fat wasn't the problem. I guess, though, it was never accepted in the field. So when I go back now, I can find trials and data, and even Framingham, like from 4 to 5 decades ago, where you can read the data and say, hold on a minute. And renowned lipidologist Michael Gurr in the UK wrote a 50-page excellent report in '98. Never really saw it published. You got to dig for these. And he kind of went through exactly what we're talking about, that the evidence is not there for fat being a problem. And I used a couple of his graphs, actually. So you had people of that stature who were flagging it. But I think the political reality, the economic reality, was just not going to allow a huge shift or a volte face from the current hypothesis. Explaining exactly why it's human nature. You know, large groups of people are all aligned behind an idea, find it very hard to change that idea, particularly if it's going to cause a lot of disruption and a lot of loss of face. So more recently, it's just becoming impossible to maintain in the light of the evidence. I know Gary Taubes wrote the book, How We Get Fat, 10 years ago, and a lot of people thought, because it was so excellently written and so clear, that, you know, this is going to change everything. But it didn't. So there's an enormous inertia out there, and still is, even though to me, as an engineering problem solver, I mean, the data is screaming, you know. And you mentioned there the epidemiological studies. So for engineering problem solving, and I don't want to bore people, but there's 3 fundamental pillars. And the first is comparative analysis, epidemiological or is not, Kepner-Trago. And you find the factors that track with the problem and might be worthy of investigating. The second is mechanistic evidence, where you do the root cause diagram. You take your factors that track and you show that they have clear mechanisms that can cause the problem. And the third is the experimental inference, as you say, and that's the huge one. So I think for a long time, a lot of the focus was based on the epidemiological, and that's a very dangerous way to problem solve.
Very much so, very much so, especially in something as complicated as nutrition science as well. So where there are so many kind of confounding variables that it's almost impossible to kind of put that off, set that aside to actually get the answer from epidemiology. It's impossible. To get the true answer. And when we do run these randomized controlled trials of having low carb, high fat diets versus low fat, high carb diets, the health outcomes tend to be better in the low carb, high fat diet. And in the past 15 years, from all of the randomized controlled trials that I know of, they have 100% come out better. So what's going on there?
Well, when they're done properly. So there were a lot of trials done where you take the cohort that's high fat or average fat, and you basically just let them go on as they are. And then you put people on lower fat, and you counsel them on smoking, and you get them to exercise, and you do your damnedest to make that work. So you're not even changing one factor and looking at it properly. And when a lot of those trials came out with no real result, somehow the abstract and the summary still said, yes, lower fat is better, even when the data didn't. And this is part of the psychology, the mass group psychology of this whole thing, you know. The other thing with experiments is you really need to change your factor through many different levels. So very high fat, moderate. But a lot of experiments, they did 40% fat and maybe 33, and then all you're going to get is noise.
Mm-hmm.
But that's why Dr. Finney, Dr. Volek I referred to, and many others have done proper experiments. So I try and make sure I don't have confirmation bias myself and pick the studies that suit my belief. But I find that the properly done studies are the ones that illustrate the answer. So I pick those, like Volek's and Finney's work, and Krauss. But experiments, a huge amount is, it's critical that the design of the experiment is correct to remove confounding, to randomize properly. And there wasn't a whole lot of that at times a few decades ago.
Absolutely, and hopefully it's going to be getting better over the coming decades, especially with the Nutrition Science Initiative starting to do a lot of kind of rigorous work there. But it really interests me that from your kind of engineering background, that again, you looked at the raw data and sort of went through all your analysis there and came out with kind of the same theory as kind of people kind of before you that have sort of come up with the same thing. So why is it that cholesterol isn't necessarily causing heart disease, and why does saturated fat not clog our arteries and things like this?
Well, yeah, so saturated fat, excessive carbohydrate in the diet, and you can argue about what constitutes excessive. It will depend on individuals, and I believe I talked to that. But excessive carbohydrate drives de novo lipogenesis, drives the creation of triglyceride, generates triglyceride-rich VLDL, and that is connected mechanistically then to the small dense LDL phenotype that we see. So it's carbohydrate that's kind of the primary driver of the issues. That's my opinion, and many in the field now, as you say. And also insulin. So the provoking of insulin excessively, and we know that diabetes is going up exponentially. But the provocation of excess insulin, there are many mechanisms by which that's very problematic for health. And I'm actually studying at the moment on insulin specifically. And again, there's some incredible data in the literature going back 40 years tracking insulin specifically with coronary heart disease. So that's carbohydrate. Carbohydrate is at the scene of the crime. Carbohydrate has all the mechanisms for doing this. And as you say, the proper experiments clearly show higher carbohydrate drives small dense LDL, drives that expression of phenotype that's problematic, drives up blood glucose, which is another clear correlator with mortality. Mm-hmm. As it happens with me, the carbohydrate was driving up the GGT, which has got excellent correlations of mortality. So it's like this massive pile of evidence all saying the same thing. On the fat side, and in my seminar on sugar, I didn't really say much about mechanisms. You know, they force mechanisms in rats and mice, and if you're insulin resistant by carbohydrate excess, then your fat metabolism is impacted. So then when you take fat, when you've taken too much carb, fat is a problem. But fat in the absence of excessive carbohydrate is a clean burning fuel, is the way I view it. An excellent clean burning fuel, low inflammation, very low push towards dysfunction of the system. It just works really well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I touched on kind of the root cause of what's going on here. Just in your answer there with the small dense LDL particles. So conceptually, kind of like on a large population scale, in the mass consciousness, we have this concept of HDL cholesterol being good, and then LDL cholesterol being bad. But then LDL itself, the so-called bad cholesterol, is kind of split off into two subparticles. So tell us a little bit about that and the mechanisms, what's kind of driving this heart disease problem with cholesterol.
Okay. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So HDL is generally accepted to be good. And because the key metric is the ratio of the HDL to LDL, HDL being high gives you a good ratio regardless of the LDL concentration. But on the small dense, so it's still is being debated whether the small dense actually causes a problem or is just associated. So generally I'm of the opinion that when you drive a small dense LDL distribution, and there's not much difference in size, I mean there's a few nanometers, so it's very small size difference. There are theories around the small dense oxidizes more readily and becomes problematic and gets caught in the endothelium and is absorbed. And there are some theories around the smallness allows it to get in there, but that doesn't make sense because it's 70 nanometer to pass particles in the endothelium, and we're talking 20 versus 23. So I think the question is whether small is actually causal or just associates with when you're doing the wrong stuff. And I think it's more the latter. So small dense is a great tracker for disease. So if you don't have small dense and you have all large fluffy, like they call it, then you know you're not doing a bad thing and your system is pretty good. Whether it's causal or not, it's another matter. Another big one that's come out in the last few years is the nuclear magnetic resonance or particle count. So the count of your LDL particles does track with disease and mortality. And that's another really good metric. I think the problem, or a big problem I tried to highlight, was looking at just LDL concentration or total cholesterol as a risk factor. From the data, from everything I've gone through, it is not a good measure to work by. So someone can have a total cholesterol of 8, which is obviously way above 5, but a lot of the properly done trials show that it doesn't really correlate with mortality when it's properly assessed. And it's the ratios, again and again, of total to HDL, triglyceride to HDL, and as you say, the small dense phenotype and the particle count. I mean, these are the metrics that are needed to assess risk. But our traditional ones, I'm just surprised they could have been used really to give prognosis. But there you are. That's what the data says. That's why I go to the raw data, because if I read many books, I might come away with the impression that total cholesterol is the big metric, or LDL. Yeah.
That's it. Because again, total cholesterol almost meaningless, right? On the weekend, I went to a friend's housewarming party, and he's been following kind of a low-carb, high-fat diet for the past 3 months, and fortunately it's worked out very well for him. He's lost 6 kilos, and he says he feels a lot more energetic and just generally a lot better well-being. But his cholesterol profile, according to his doctor, he should start thinking about maybe taking statins, right? And it's only something like, I think it was 5.5 millimoles in total, right? So it's fine, right? And his LDL is just over 3 millimoles, but his triglycerides are at 0.7, right? And his HDL is at 1.7 as well. So to me, I'm looking at that cholesterol profile and I'm thinking, that's great. It's fine. Because the one thing that the folks that are watching and listening to this, from the research that I've done and the people that I've spoken to, is that you kind of want low triglycerides and high HDL, and that kind of starts to give you an idea about what's happening with your LDL. Now, from your research, what is it that you found?
Well, absolutely that. So through the trials, the actual data, there's no question. The ratios that we mentioned, I won't go through them again. There was Harvard Medical School sent out some report about triglycerides over HDL ratio being up to 10 or 15 times more predictive than LDL. And lots of this has been published, but it just doesn't seem to get out into the public arena, or even sometimes amongst the medical world. So the ratios are really good predictors, and they all check out from an engineering sense. The total over HDL, the trig over HDL, and of course if you can get the NMR and the particle size and count, super. But also the other metrics are like blood glucose level and HbA1c and your long-term blood glucose. That's a massive metric. Some beautiful data around that. Loads and loads of reports and studies. And I'm going to begin to publish snippets over time. And insulin. I believe insulin is hardly even looked at unless you're diabetic. and it's an amazing marker that associates with mortality and disease. And I think Yudkin, someone just mentioned the other day, Yudkin back in the 70s was clearly calling out insulin as a major component of the heart disease risk matrix. And I believe he's absolutely right. And it's a quick test, but it's not really done as far as I'm aware. I mentioned in the seminar, if I could only have one metric that I could use to live my life and watch my health by, I'd probably go with fasting insulin. Because when your fasting insulin is extremely low, by whichever means you get to that, you can be pretty sure that all the other dyslipidemias and all the other dysfunction is going to be dragged down with it. And that's based on the data. So these are great metrics, and they're freely available in blood tests, besides the NMR. And I think they should be leveraged a lot more to look at the total risk. I even toyed with the idea of, and I'll do it at some point, of putting all these metrics based on the data into an Excel sheet and then eject a response surface of risk and where you are on it. Now, obviously, I won't be prescribing or anything. I'm not going to give that to people. I'm not in a position to. But I'm just really interested in it. If you treat this as an engineering, problem-solving thing, it's actually not that complicated because so much work has already been done. I can reach out and access all the work. If you had to start doing the work to understand it, it would be really bad. But you were saying it's complex, but the work's been done.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is the thing with this conundrum, as you eloquently put, is that the kind of the solution is there. We have the answers, but it's about having people actually apply these answers. Because when you tell people that eating eggs and coconut oil and even bacon for breakfast can improve your risk for heart disease by obviously decreasing it. People look at you like you're an absolute insane person. And one question that we have on the comments on the blog from Larry Diamond in Texas. Yeah, absolutely. Larry's great. And he asked, how do you explain this to a friend? Say if you were down the pub just with your mates and they kind of ask you about this YouTube lecture that you've done, and they're like, right, I want you to distill this in like 30 seconds. What would you say?
Well,
30 seconds.
Yeah, well, let's say, I just said that basically there was a major scientific misunderstanding that occurred a long time ago. The data has been there for probably 30 years now that was incorrect about fat being bad. Fat can be bad if you have excessive carbohydrate coming in also. Carbohydrate is a high octane fuel. It needs your body's insulin to manage it in your bloodstream. And when you're taking in carbohydrate, it shuts down fat metabolism. And therefore the fat can build up, to use a phrase, and become a problem. But otherwise, if you take in fat in a healthily higher amount with lower carbohydrate, it burns as a very clean burning fuel. And that's basically the kernel of it. A mistaken hypothesis is now getting fixed. But it's simply around that it's high carbohydrate that actually creates the high levels of blood fat that are a problem. And that's probably a big thing to get people over. It's not intuitive. It's carbohydrate that creates the problematic fats in your blood. And it's, for people who know me and they know my background and I'm pretty hardcore technically, they kind of know, well, he must be right, but it just seems so weird. The problem, Sam, to be honest, is these people have been taught from birth that fat is bad. And you're right. And when you say it's good, it's kind of crazy. I had a Jewish friend who actually left the religion, and he found for a long period eating pork, he almost couldn't do it, even though he had changed completely and given it up. It's mentally wired. Even I found it the first month or two, eating fried food, difficult. The psychology is, so that's why it's going to be so hard to switch.
Yeah, absolutely. Because this idea of fat being bad has kind of been pushed, particularly over the past 40 years, and it's what psychologists call an imprinted idea. It's like the duckling sees, say, an alligator for the first time when it comes out of the egg and thinks that that's its mother, right? So this idea is imprinted in your consciousness, and even though, as you say, you've looked at the raw data and you know that that saturated fat is not actually associated with heart disease at all, and well, it doesn't cause it. And even though you are eating these things and you know this, it's still kind of confusing in your head and conflicting.
Yeah, no, very well put. That's just the way it is, and we'll just have to overcome that. But there's some fantastic people now in the community, and I won't start naming them. I'll leave some out, but you know, there's so many people now in very, very strong positions to get this message out. But it's still going to take years, I reckon.
Yeah. Oh yeah. This conundrum is going to take a few decades, I'd say, to kind of get over. Now we do have another question for you from, let me just get this up, Kumar Inamdar, and he asked, GPs work out a risk percentage for patients with high cholesterol based on age. How reliable is this marker? And above what percentage level should one consider taking statins?
Okay, so you'll forgive me maybe if I don't tread too heavily into the area of medication or prescription. I
Absolutely.
believe the original guidelines, and I haven't particularly studied them, to be honest, because I go to the raw data, and those kind of medical world guidelines, I haven't really gone into them. So I know that there was a 20% risk above which you would prescribe, and I believe that a lot of the data in those algorithms is based on Framingham. And I guess that probably seems reasonable. The new guidelines, I think, are getting a lot of attention. And, you know, Asim Malhotra and many others are questioning them. I don't really want to get caught up in that. My perception is, yes, the new guidelines are very prescriptive for primary prevention. My understanding is that for secondary prevention of people who have heart disease and a heart attack, you know, there are mortality benefits. For primary, it's a very grey area. So whether it's 20% or 10%, I think the whole area needs to be better understood, rather than which value you pick. And I mentioned in the seminar, I think there's a few reasons the trials may be not ideal. Say if you take 50,000 people ready to go into a trial, sometimes 20 to 30,000 might be taken out in advance for non-clear reasons. So I'm not sure how balanced the experiments may have been. I don't know. And also familial hypercholesterolemia is at a low percentage in the populations. And I've noticed that in some trials, they've kind of targeted people with heart issues. So you'll get a much larger percentage of familial hypercholesterolemics in there. And if you look at those trials and say, well, X, Y, Z happens, you can't really apply that back to the general population because it was a targeted population. These are relatively subtle engineering type things that, you know, I'd have some concerns in general, but I couldn't say what's correct and what's not. Wouldn't be appropriate. But I'm happy I know myself what the metrics mean.
Absolutely. Last question for you is, what did you eat for breakfast today, and what did you eat for breakfast a year ago?
Oh, well, I'll start with a year ago. It would have been cereals and, you know, pretty much classic cereals or
semi-skim milk.
Yeah, milk and bagels. You know, bagels was popular enough because they're kind of whole grain bagels, and I just think, but anyway, I know now. Now what I have is I regularly enough have nothing for breakfast because I'll just go in, I'll be in mild ketosis, we won't get into that, in the morning, and I'll go through to lunch. Or I'll have a breakfast and I won't have lunch. So I'm not saying people should do this. It suits me to eat approximately twice a day. I like going into kind of mild ketosis. I like burning my fat. The body, there's quite significant evidence that the body, when not digesting, when utilizing your own resources, you know, goes into a kind of healing mode. So I kind of like the idea, and I also eat probably, I don't know, half the calories I used to. I mean,
Hmm.
I eat relatively little, but I'm never really hungry. And this speaks to the satiety, eating in an evolutionary style, because 50,000 years ago, we would have had to go a few days with no food and then be able to chase and hunt down an animal to survive. You know, now people in the middle of the afternoon can't function because it's been 2 hours since their dinner. So the whole thing is crazy, as you well know. When you
Hmm.
go high fat, low carb, everything gets better. Just everything. Appetite control, physique, mental, um, or mental kind of speed, if you like,
Hmm.
and just well-being, huge well-being, as you know.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the way that I like to explain to it is that sugar, refined carbohydrates, and fake foods is what's quarantining your body fat stores, right? So you aren't able to touch that at all. And until you get rid of those fake foods, you're not going to be able to touch it. And when you do get rid of the fake foods, then what I call biochemical limescale kind of washes away and opens up the sink for all of your energy to flow out, basically. And so yeah, it liberates your body fat stores into energy, and then that's why like a lot of people see their energy go up despite not eating quite as much before, but also feel satisfied at the same time.
Absolutely, that's a great analogy. Actually, I might use it if you don't mind.
No worries, no worries. I'll send you the video that explains it quite succinctly, using a kind of sink analogy. Regular watchers and listeners will know about that. Know
Oh
about
yeah,
that. But yeah, I'll send you that. Ivor, feel free to use it in your forthcoming lectures. But yeah, thank you again so much for your time today, Ivor. Where can people find out more information about you and get in contact as well?
well, I guess thefatemperor.com, the website has all the links to the Facebook and the Twitter and so forth. So that's it. And the only thing I'd say is I'm getting a lot of questions. And just to say to people that, you know, I'm quite busy in my main life and, you know, family. So if I don't get back to people or answer everything, you know, it's nothing to do with the person. But I'd just like to mention as well, just as a last thing, Jeffrey Gerber, who runs Denver's Diet Doctor in Littleton, Colorado, has been a huge support. And I think my material resonated with some of his real life observations and his hypothesis. And, you know, it's been fantastic. And he's just one of many in the community. There's an incredible community out there for low carb, high fat of people who have realized the proper hypothesis and are very supportive, and it's fantastic actually to be part of it.
Brilliant, brilliant. It was a pleasure to have you as part of the community. I've a real pleasure. I highly recommend everybody going to thefatemperor.com and checking out all the stuff that Ivor's putting out there, and in the future as well. So again, thank you so much again, Ivor. And there's only one more thing to do, and that's to hear a smash it out from yourself. So on three, I'd like you to shout "smash it out" to the camera. So 1, 2, 3.
Smash it out!
Whey! There we go. There we go. That's fantastic,
Okay.
Ivor. Much appreciated. Much appreciated. Well, I'll let you get on with your day, and hopefully, if you got an upcoming lecture and you'd like to chat about it, we'll get you back on the show to chat about it.
And no, thank you very much, Sam. It was a pleasure actually. Thanks very much.
Absolutely fantastic, Ivor. Thanks a lot, mate.
Bye now.